Imagine a company so dominant that it defined how millions rented movies around the world, and yet it watched the future walk away for $50 million. This is not a tale of instant ruin, but of gradual blindness, small decisions stacking into catastrophic consequence over a decade of change. It is a story of human psychology and corporate incentives colliding with technology, where profit motives masked strategic vulnerability until it was too late. If you think you know this story because you heard the punchline, stay with me. Because the full narrative explains how a behemoth staked its life on late fees and missed a quiet offer that would rewrite media history. The Blockbuster of the 1990s was not merely a store chain. It was the ritual for Friday nights in countless suburban neighborhoods across America and beyond. Rows of videotapes and later DVDs created an ecosystem where families and friends browsed, planned, and argued over what to watch, creating monthly habits that felt like traditions more than transactions. Its dominance looked unassailable because its stores were visible and ubiquitous, occupying high rent corners and malls where foot traffic turned film into daily commerce and local culture. Competitors existed, but the brand scale, retail footprint, and studio relationships made it hard for upstarts to break into the market without deep pockets or major technological advantages. Behind the friendly blue and yellow branding lay a business model with a crucial hidden engine working quietly in the background to fuel profits and investor expectations. Late fees, those small penalties that felt inevitable when a movie came home late, accounted for roughly 16% of Blockbuster's revenue at the height of its power, becoming a predictable cash cow for corporate accounting. This reliance turned a customer annoyance into a structural profit center, creating incentives that were at odds with customer goodwill and long-term retention, even as they padded quarterly results. When a revenue line becomes psychologically essential to management, it warps decision-making, and Blockbuster's attachment to late fees subtly hardened into resistance against models that prioritized customer convenience over immediate penalty income. To understand how the company fell, you have to understand incentives, and for Blockbuster, those incentives were baked into both culture and quarterly financial reporting, in ways that were hard to see from inside. Managers were rewarded for hitting short-term targets that included revenue from late fees, creating a culture that normalized punishment for customer delay rather than celebrating loyalty or frictionless service. When executives faced the choice between cannibalizing a known profitable revenue stream and experimenting with an unknown new distribution model, the comfortable decision felt rational inside boardrooms that feared earnings shocks more than technological change. This is the paradox of incumbency. What made Blockbuster successful in stores also made it slow and defensive when the market began to move away from store visits and toward convenience and subscription. Meanwhile, in a small office, and later a modest warehouse, Netflix was experimenting with a different promise: subscriptions without due dates, humble convenience delivered by mail, and later by streaming technology. The founders, Reed Hastings and Mark Randolph, had spent long nights refining logistics and customer psychology, believing that convenience, selection, and predictable pricing could disrupt the entrenched retail rental model. Netflix's early bet was simple and psychologically shrewd because it removed the pain point for customers, replacing late fees with a predictable monthly relationship that encouraged longer engagement rather than punitive transactions. What Blockbuster saw, if it saw anything at the time, looked like a niche mail order experiment rather than an existential competitive threat to a sprawling retail empire whose profits came from storefronts and penalties. The year 2000 is often recounted in history books as the moment when a major decision could have erased one brand and raised another in a different form, and inside that year a pivotal conversation almost changed everything. Reed Hastings walked into Blockbuster's offices offering to sell Netflix for $50 million, a number that today carries mythic weight as the price of a missed future. And he was met with skepticism and polite rejection. To Blockbuster executives, the offer looked small compared to their market capitalization and their sprawling retail assets, and they believed their scale and store footprint would allow them to outcompete any upstart when necessary. What they did not fully appreciate was that the value of Netflix was not just in current customers or delivered discs, but in a mindset and infrastructure tuned to subscription, economics, and future streaming distribution. The rejection story became part of Silicon Valley lore because it crystallized a failure to imagine how technology could change customer behavior, and therefore the entire industry's profit mechanics in a short time frame. Blockbuster's logic was internally coherent. They had stores, supply chains, and negotiating power with studios, and $50 million seemed like a rounding error against the risk of disrupting partnerships that generated immediate revenue. But the flaw in that reasoning was a failure to understand the option value of a new distribution network centered on subscriptions and convenience, rather than episodic, penalized transactions. In effect, Blockbuster looked at the present balance sheet and saw little urgency, while Netflix and a set of visionary investors saw the contours of a fundamentally different customer relationship forming across technology and culture. The psychology of the decision makers is a key part of the narrative because humans anchor on current success and discount the ambiguous future in ways that are predictable and often costly. Executives at Blockbuster had built careers on optimizing store metrics and cutting costs in physical retail. And the idea of destroying a lucrative revenue stream to chase an unproven subscription model felt reckless rather than visionary. When organizational incentives favor short-term stability, leaders are often punished by investors for perceived experiments that risk current earnings. And this social pressure can freeze strategic innovation when it is needed most. The Netflix offer therefore arrived at a moment when cognitive biases and structural incentives combined to make a counterintuitive decision look perfectly defensible to many inside the company. But the story is not only one of missed acquisition, it is also about how Blockbuster multiplied the strategic error by reacting slowly and inadequately as the market changed around it. After turning down the sale, Blockbuster launched its own online offering and experimented with mail rentals. But these efforts were late, unfocused, and unable to change the company's core economics fast enough to matter. The company remained tethered to its storefront mentality and clung to practices, including late fees and per-rental pricing, that were increasingly incongruent with a market moving toward subscription and on-demand consumption. This half-hearted response followed a familiar pattern where incumbents attempt to replicate new models without fully committing to the cultural and structural changes required to make those models work at scale. Competition in technology markets is not only about product features, but about timing and the ability to adapt organizational DNA to new paradigms quickly and decisively. Netflix's small, nimble structure allowed them to iterate on user experience, recommendation algorithms, and logistics, while Blockbuster's sprawling system of stores and staff made rapid transformation costly and culturally painful. The advantage of incumbency can flip when the source of value shifts from physical assets to software-driven relationships. And that pivot requires a willingness to cannibalize established revenue streams that many incumbents resist. In retrospect, the pivot required more than a new website. It required a reconfiguration of incentives, talent, and capital allocation that Blockbuster was unwilling or unable to undertake before the market passed it by. Managers who grew up optimizing physical retail metrics often struggle to accept that assets, which once protected a business, can become liabilities as consumer behavior evolves and distribution changes. For Blockbuster, the cost of maintaining a store footprint and the associated labor and inventory systems increasingly weighed down the company as streaming economics required far less physical infrastructure and different skills. This mismatch created a drag on margins and strategic flexibility, making it difficult for Blockbuster to fund the kind of software and distribution investments necessary to compete with digital-first players. The resulting strategic inertia turned the company's size from a strength that delivered predictable profits into a burden that amplified losses as technology reconfigured the market. While the public narrative often reduces the timeline to a few headlines, the reality was a multi-year erosion where small tactical missteps compounded into terminal strategic disadvantage. Blockbuster continued to franchise stores aggressively while also experimenting with digital ideas that never received the full operational focus or capital to become dominant in the new era of streaming. Each quarter that passed with declining store traffic and stubborn late fee revenue made the transformation even harder because investors and lenders watched profitability and demanded caution rather than radical reinvention. Strategic drift is slow and quiet, but it is lethal because it gives incumbents false comfort that the core business will hold long enough to pivot later when, in fact, the drift accelerates the death spiral. There is also a human element to failure stories that is easy to overlook when we focus only on balance sheets and market shares. Decisions are made by people with careers and reputations on the line. Executives naturally fear being blamed for risky moves that might not pay off in their tenure, and boards often prioritize short-term earnings stability over long-term experiments that could upend current profitability metrics. This creates an environment where safe incrementalism dominates strategic conversations and where existential bets are postponed until they lose strategic value entirely and cannot be executed successfully. Blockbuster's leaders were not cartoon villains, but professionals incentivized by a system that rewarded staying the course, which made a disruptive pivot feel like professional suicide until the market left them behind. Netflix, by contrast, kept iterating on its core promise and investing in customer experience and recommendation technology that made content discovery easier and more satisfying for subscribers. Where Blockbuster optimized for per-transaction revenue, Netflix optimized for retention through algorithms and a library that matched taste to content, thereby reducing churn and increasing lifetime customer value in ways that were subtle but powerful. The subscription model also shifted the company focus from extracting one-off penalties to creating long-term relationships, aligning incentives between the firm and its customers in a way that rewarded ease of use and predictable value. This alignment between product design and business model created momentum for Netflix that compound over years, yielding a strategic lead that Blockbuster could not erase with superficial digital experiments. As streaming technology matured and broadband internet became ubiquitous, the economics of delivering content shifted dramatically, and some assumptions about retail vanished almost overnight. For consumers, the calculus changed from whether to leave the house and pay late fees to whether to pay a monthly fee and access a vast catalog without penalties or due dates, changing relationships with content providers and platforms. Studios and content owners also recalibrated their distribution strategies as digital platforms offered scale, data, and new monetization paths, making exclusive retail windows less central to their revenue planning. In this ecosystem transition, companies that controlled digital relationships surged in strategic value, while those anchored to physical distribution found their leverage evaporating as consumer habits realigned around convenience. Blockbuster attempted to create a presence online, offering mail rentals and a nascent streaming service, but the efforts were underfunded and lacking the cultural shift necessary to operate as a platform company. Digital-first companies live and breathe data, rapid product iteration, and customer-centric KPIs, while Blockbuster remained tied to supply chain logistics and retail operations that required very different organizational muscles. The company's advertising and public messaging also emphasized legacy strengths, like store access, inadvertently signaling to consumers that the firm had not fully embraced the convenience future the market was already signaling it wanted. This reluctance to fully commit to the transformational requirements of a subscription and streaming first operation left Blockbuster stranded between two incompatible operating systems without mastering either. Financial pressures intensified as competition increased and new entrants poured capital into streaming, forcing Blockbuster to make increasingly difficult choices about where to allocate resources. Retail leases and staffing costs continued to eat margins while investment in technology and digital product remained peripheral to the firm's capital allocation strategy. This mismatch produced a negative feedback loop where poor digital performance reduced competitive relevance, which in turn depressed revenue and constrained the ability to invest in the very areas needed to compete. The company entered a period where options narrowed and each strategic misstep had larger consequences because the buffer of high margin in-store revenue was already eroding rapidly. By the late 2000s, the market had begun to pick winners among streaming platforms and technology. First media companies and Blockbuster's identity crisis became painfully visible to customers and investors alike. Subscribers flocked to services that delivered ease of use and vast libraries, and the public narrative shifted from nostalgic loyalty toward functional utility and the best user experience. Retail foot traffic dwindled as consumers accepted digital substitutes that were cheaper and more convenient, and the company struggled to articulate a distinctive digital value proposition that justified sustained investment. In the end, being late with a product that mimicked new models was not sufficient to regain strategic ground against incumbents that were built around those models from their inception. Bankruptcy is a blunt instrument that often arrives after years of decline, and for Blockbuster, it arrived in 2010 after a long period of strategic misalignment and revenue deterioration, when corporate liabilities exceeded the company's ability to service debt and operational cash flows. Restructuring became unavoidable, and the legal process signaled the final chapter for a brand that had once felt invincible. Employees and franchisees faced painful transitions, and customers watched a familiar cultural fixture disappear from malls and strip centers that had once been lively hubs for weekend entertainment. The bankruptcy process underscored how even dominant firms can be fragile when underlying economic structures shift and managers fail to pivot their organizations effectively to new paradigms. One of the most poignant images from this story is that almost all Blockbuster stores shuttered, yet one small franchise remained operational, becoming a relic and a symbol of stubborn survival. This lone store, located in Bend, Oregon, transformed into a tourist curiosity and a shrine to nostalgia, attracting visitors who wanted to see what the world of physical rentals once felt like in practice. The store's existence is a reminder that cultural artifacts persist in pockets, even when economic logic has shifted. And small communities sometimes place value on rituals in places that larger markets abandon. It also serves as a cautionary note about the difference between emotional attachment and sustainable business models, demonstrating how feelings of loss do not automatically translate into commercial viability. The popular narrative tends to reduce complex corporate decline into a single vulgar moral about greed or stupidity. But the honest story is messier and more instructive than a headline. It is a story about systems of incentives, cognitive biases, cultural momentum, and the difficulty of changing organizational identity when that identity is financially rewarding in the present. The lesson is not merely that incumbents should buy disruptive rivals, but that companies need processes and leadership that allow them to imagine and commit to futures that may look foolish in the short run, but are inevitable in structural terms. Blockbuster's failure is therefore a parable for leaders in any industry. Understand your incentives, test and commit early, and be willing to let go of profitable habits that will eventually corrode competitive advantage. There is also a deeper psychological truth about how customers react to convenience, and Blockbuster misread the pace at which consumers would adopt a subscription. First, relationship to content consumption. People often overestimate their attachment to physical rituals and underestimate the power of frictionless convenience when it is presented with clear value and predictable cost structures. As a result, the slow migration away from rental stores accelerated once market leaders demonstrated better user experiences and reliable catalogs, causing network effects and positive feedback loops that favored the new platforms. Blockbuster underestimated not just a technology but a shift in the social contract around media consumption, where subscriptions made ownership and penalties obsolete and created new norms of access over possession. Some analysts argue that even after rejecting the sale, Blockbuster had the assets and scale to pivot effectively if leadership had been willing to restructure aggressively and sacrifice short-term revenue streams. This perspective rests on the idea that capital access and brand strength could have been redeployed into a credible subscription and streaming platform with decisive leadership and a clear long-term plan. Yet organizational culture and the sunk costs of retail operations made such a rapid and thorough reinvention both politically difficult and operationally risky, which meant the theoretical possibility was practically unlikely. The point is not to reassign blame to individuals, but to recognize how structures and incentives can make theoretically possible strategies politically infeasible in real time. When we examine the counterfactual, what would have happened if Blockbuster had accepted the Netflix offer for $50 million? We must consider more than the price tag and more than simple hindsight. Buying Netflix would have given Blockbuster technology, subscription expertise, and access to a culture of experimentation that could have accelerated digital adoption inside the company if integrated well and funded properly. However, acquisition alone does not guarantee successful integration. History is full of companies that bought skill sets they then smothered under legacy processes and poor change management. Thus, the real lesson is that acquisitions can alter destinies only when firms are willing to overhaul their incentives and operations to prioritize the acquired capabilities, rather than merely owning them on paper. There are three institutional takeaways for leaders in fast-changing markets that this story makes painfully clear, and each is grounded in the interplay between incentives, imagination, and timing. First, track the economic levers that make or break your model and avoid creating dependency on revenue streams that destroy customer goodwill or misalign incentives over time. Second, cultivate organizational structures that can explore and incubate risky but critical future options without being penalized for near-term earnings impacts, thereby preserving strategic optionality. Third, treat acquisitions as transformational only when they are paired with a willingness to integrate culture, metrics, and leadership in ways that reinforce rather than dilute the acquired assets. The Blockbuster Netflix story also teaches us about the broader nature of disruption in capitalist systems, where incumbents have both the resources to win and the institutional frictions that make them slow. Disruption thrives where new technologies realign customer incentives and reduce the marginal cost of serving additional customers. And in those moments, small, agile players can outcompete giants with greater resources but slower decision cycles. This dynamic is not new and will repeat in many industries where digital technologies shift value from physical assets to data and relationships, placing a premium on adaptability and foresight. Studying the case helps leaders recognize the structural signs of impending disruption and to design governance systems capable of acting before the market has fully validated a new paradigm. There is a moral undercurrent to the tale that resonates with people because it touches on pride, regret, and the limits of corporate foresight when fortunes are tied to past successes. For communities and workers who built careers around the physical storefront, the collapse of Blockbuster represented not only economic loss but the erosion of shared social rituals and Friday night traditions. These human costs are easy to forget when we analyze balance sheets, but they remind us that corporate transitions have real effects on lives and livelihoods in specific places. In studying failure, we should therefore balance lessons for managers with empathy for the people who experience upheaval and deserve thoughtful approaches to transitions and retraining. Looking back, it is tempting to cast Blockbuster as a villain of progress and Netflix as the lone heroic innovator, but real history is seldom that clean or moralistic in character. Netflix itself would later face new competition and must continually adapt to remain relevant, showing that success is temporary when markets evolve and competition emerges from unexpected places. Moreover, innovations like streaming changed how artists, studios, and audiences relate to content, producing both new creative opportunities and new structural challenges for distribution and revenue sharing. Thus, while the story centers on two companies, it is really about an industry and society learning to reorder how content is produced, distributed, and consumed in response to technological change. In the years since Blockbuster's decline, many firms have tried to avoid similar fates by building incubators, separate innovation units, and acquisition strategies designed to keep options open. Some of these structural reforms work well when accompanied by genuine autonomy, clear metrics, and protected funding. But many fail when the parent company exerts control that undermines the startup's agility. The lesson is that organizational architecture matters. Protect the conditions for experimentation, and avoid suffocating new ventures with legacy processes that kill the very adaptability they require. Companies that balance the discipline of core operations with the freedom to explore risky futures stand a better chance of surviving transformational shifts than those that rely solely on scale and brand recognition. Of course, not every incumbent can or should pivot to become a disruptive juggernaut, and some strategic choices depend on industry context, capital intensity, and regulatory environments. The smart strategic question is not whether to always buy disruptors, but how to maintain the strategic optionality to pivot when structural signals indicate a reordering of customer value. Sometimes the right play is to double down on differentiated strengths that remain valuable even as parts of the market change, but such plays require honest assessment and courage to let go of fading franchises. Blockbuster's tragedy was not simply that it grew big or made mistakes, but that it failed to adjust its identity and incentives quickly enough to survive a profound market transformation. There is also an educational component here for investors and boards who must judge strategies that have asymmetric payoffs and long horizons, where patience and vision can be rewarded or punished in complex ways. Boards should foster environments where management can experiment with new models without being penalized for short-term earnings volatility when the experiment aims to secure the company's long-term survival. This requires a culture of trust and governance mechanisms that align executive incentives with sustainable transformation rather than quarter smoothing of earnings at the expense of strategic renewal. The Blockbuster episode offers a caution for governance. Failing to embed long horizon thinking into oversight can slow necessary action until the window for effective change closes irrevocably. The final chapters of Blockbuster's story have a bittersweet rhythm, with the company filing for bankruptcy and closing thousands of stores while customers and communities watched familiar rituals vanish. The last store in Bend became a cultural touchstone, a place where nostalgia and curiosity intersected and tourists lined up to take pictures under the iconic blue and yellow sign. That single remaining storefront tells us something about the persistence of memory and the human tendency to preserve relics, even when economics has moved on, offering a living museum of analog consumption. At the same time, the broader industry had already moved forward, remaking how content is funded, discovered, and consumed in ways that would have been difficult to reverse, even with a different decision in 2000. If there is a single modern relevance to this saga, it is that disruption is a process that rewards foresight and penalizes the comfort of existing profitable habits when customer values shift. Managers today can study this case as a reminder to question which parts of their revenue model are durable and which are likely to be eroded by technological and behavioral change. It is less about moralizing on hubris and more about building institutions that can react intelligently to early signals and that can redeploy capital and talent toward future. Facing options when necessary, the real strategic failure is not losing a particular technology race, but failing to recognize that the rules of competition have changed and refusing to adapt in time to remain relevant. There is also a subtle ethical dimension when companies profit from customer pain, and Blockbuster's dependence on late fees raises questions about sustainable business practices and the long-term costs of extracting value through penalties. Businesses that rely on friction, fines, and punitive charges can achieve short-term profitability, but they often sow the seeds of their own obsolescence by alienating customers and inviting alternative models that reward ease and fairness. In consumer-facing industries particularly, aligning product incentives with customer well-being and delight often proves not only ethically sound, but strategically superior in the long run. Blockbuster's late fee model demonstrates how profit motives can blind organizations to the corrosive long-term effects that such practices have on brand trust and market resilience. We should also consider the counterfactual lessons for Netflix, which after being rejected transformed the perceived bargain into a strategic advantage by doubling down on subscription economics and customer experience. Reed Hastings and his team took the rejection and used it as motivation to refine their product and visions, showing how small firms can harness adversity to sharpen strategic focus and long-term thinking. Netflix's investments in recommendations, original content, and global expansion illustrate how adaptive strategy and reinvestment can translate a modest pioneer into an industry leader over time. Thus, the narrative is not purely about Blockbuster's folly, but also about how entrepreneurs can take what seemed like a rejection and leverage it into a durable competitive advantage through relentless iterations. As technology evolves further, new parallels will emerge in other industries where platforms replace physical distribution and data-driven relationships, supplant transactional retail models, healthcare, education, transportation. And financial services all face potential seismic shifts, where incumbents must either adapt structurally or risk similar fates to legacy media retailers who missed the digital wave. Managers in those sectors can learn from the Blockbuster story by investing early in customer data, experimentation, and business model innovation rather than relying solely on comfortable and familiar revenue streams. The ability to imagine alternative futures and to allocate resources to explore them without fatal constraint may determine which firms survive and which become nostalgic footnotes in industrial histories. It is worth noting that cultural nostalgia can sometimes obscure economic realities, producing a wistful longing for experiences that were never actually efficient or sustainable. The ritual of browsing aisles and owning physical copies had undeniable charm, but it also carried friction and costs that digital services removed from many consumers, and that contributed to better access and variety. When we mourn the loss of cultural rituals, we must also balance that sorrow with recognition of how new models can democratize access to content and reduce barriers for creators and audiences alike. The goal in reflecting on Blockbuster's fall is not to lament change alone, but to understand how change creates winners and losers, and how societies can manage transitions equitably and intelligently. For entrepreneurs trying to displace incumbents, the case demonstrates that small firms can exploit friction points and align incentives with customer delight to build sustainable growth trajectories. Successful disruption often begins by solving a painful customer problem in a way that incumbents find unattractive because it threatens profitable but fragile revenue sources. By focusing relentlessly on customer experience and by leveraging technology to lower marginal costs, startups can create value that compounds and eventually undermines traditional business models. The Blockbuster story should therefore inspire creative insurgency, but also remind founders that scaling responsibly requires building the organizational capabilities to sustain growth beyond initial novelty. If you rewind further, you see how strategic foresight is not only about predicting technology, but about appreciating how consumer psychology and institutional incentives will shape adoption curves over time. Forecasting technologies rarely fails because the tech is bad, but because managers misread how incentives and culture influence whether customers embrace or ignore innovations. This suggests that successful strategy blends technological insight with deep empathy for customer behavior and an honest appraisal of the organizational changes required to meet that behavior effectively. Blockbuster's leadership did not lack intellect or experience, but they lacked a willingness to rewire their incentives and operations to match a fundamentally altered consumer contract for media access. A final ironic note is that the $50 million figure that reads like a scandalous bargain in hindsight was simultaneously a trivial sum for a company that viewed its market dominance as secure and eternal. This perception of triviality blinded decision makers to the option value implicit in a nascent subscription business, an option that would compound into enormous strategic leverage as technology matured. The moral is not to assign a single monetary threshold for salvation, but to ensure that management recognizes when small investments can buy critical strategic capabilities that matter disproportionately to future competition. If leaders treat future options as negligible because their present looks comfortable, they risk mispricing the cost of inaction in a world where value can migrate rapidly between asset classes. The story also reminds us that narratives of business history are shaped by the survivors, and we should approach them with humility because the drivers of success and failure are often complex and intertwined. Winners like Netflix are as much products of timing, investor patience, and cultural shifts as they are of brilliant strategy. And losers like Blockbuster are as much victims of structural change as of managerial mistakes. Recognizing this complexity helps us extract more useful lessons about governance, incentives, and organizational design, rather than settling for simple moral judgments about foresight or competence. Our job as analysts and managers is to parse those complexities and design institutions that are resilient to the kinds of shifts that felled once seemingly indomitable firms. As the video comes to a close, it is helpful to remember that business history is not destiny, and that the structural changes that can topple companies also create opportunities for new kinds of value and social benefit. Streaming democratized access to films and television in ways that changed the economics of content production and made distribution more accessible to a broader set of creators, while Blockbuster's disappearance had local costs. The broader ecosystem evolved in ways that supported new forms of creativity and international reach that were previously difficult to achieve economically for many creators. The question for leaders today is how to guide transitions so they maximize the potential benefits while mitigating the social and economic harms for those displaced by technological change. Before we end, it is worth stating clearly that strategy is a moral exercise as much as an economic one, because choices about revenue models and customer treatment reflect values that ripple beyond balance sheets. Blockbuster's attachment to late fees reveals a model that prioritized short-term extraction over long-term loyalty, which invites questions about what values companies should honor in pursuit of profit. In designing business models today, leaders should weigh not only financial returns, but also the kinds of relationships those models create with customers, employees, and communities over time. A more humane capitalism would reward firms that build durable, trust-based relationships rather than those that profit primarily from friction and penalties that degrade the customer experience. This is a story that keeps reappearing in different guise across industries, because the underlying dynamics, technology, incentives, human psychology, are universal and stubbornly repeatable. Managers who learn deeply from such case studies can build organizations that are less likely to be surprised by structural change and better equipped to act when early signals indicate a shift is underway. The goal is not perfect prediction, but robust adaptation. Designing companies that can experiment at scale while preserving the capacity to learn and reallocate resources to promising futures. Blockbuster's history is therefore a cautionary tale and a practical lesson, offering both emotional resonance and concrete insights for anyone trying to lead through change. If you've made it this far, you understand that the Blockbuster Netflix episode is less about a single rejected check and more about how institutions adapt or fail in the face of disruptive change. The $50 million offer is a dramatic hinge in the narrative. But the real hinge was the inability to change organizational incentives and to imagine a future where late fees were not only unnecessary but toxic to growth. To be resilient, companies must create governance, compensation, and cultural systems that reward early experimentation and that are willing to tolerate failure as part of learning about new business models. If you take away one idea from this story, let it be that strategic flexibility and customer-aligned incentives are the best insurance against becoming a cautionary tale in someone else's lecture. Thanks for watching this deep dive into the rise and fall of Blockbuster and the quiet beginnings of a company called Netflix that changed how we experience media. If this story gave you a fresh perspective on incentives, disruption, or the human side of corporate decision making, please consider subscribing so we can explore more stories that blend history, economics, and psychology. There are many more cases like this where small decisions accumulate into transformative outcomes, and understanding them helps us build better institutions and more humane organizations for the future. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe, and we will meet again to unpack another story where technology and human choice collide in dramatic and meaningful ways.